Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this webinar. My name is Toby Webb, founder of Innovation Forum. I'm delighted to be chairing this discussion today. We're looking forward to a really fascinating quickfire next hour, and we're just going to wait at 30 seconds or so for our participants to come through. We had well over 1,000 registrations for this webinar. It shows you just how popular the topic is, even if organised at relatively short notice. We still have a great audience with us today, so we're just going to allow for those folks who have signed up to come through the waiting room in the usual way, and I shall introduce what we're doing. But it's a delight to chair this session on Nestlé's new report towards a forest positive future. I come to you today from one of those heavily forested countries in Europe, a prize if any of you can guess which one that is, with 42 to 50% forest cover, but only about 0.4 of 1% of natural forest untouched, which shows you just how much we have done forestry, as you might call it, in Europe over the last couple of centuries. The country is Latvia, and they now have a pretty sustainable forestry approach, but still much of their land has been adjusted, as we see in Europe. So it seems like an appropriate place, the middle of a forest, to talk about a forest positive future and the contribution Nestlé wants to make to that, but also that others can make to this important topic, because it cannot be done alone, as we know. And that's part of the reason for today's discussion, I believe, is to encourage collaboration and to encourage us to get on the same page as we move from zero deforestation to forest positive. And those are two quite different things in action. And that's what we're going to be exploring over the next hour. As many of you know, Nestlé made a commitment to end deforestation in its supply chain in 2010. Didn't quite get there by the end of 2020, but then who did? And I think the company has made remarkable progress since that Kit Kat commercial by Greenpeace of 10 years ago, which I think was one of the reasons many companies took actions in this space, although by no means the only one. A lot of progress has taken place since then. And so in this discussion for the next hour, we're going to be discussing how we implement forward-looking approaches to deforestation risks, the all-important topic of land rights and community rights in forest conservation. It all starts with people. As the old cliche goes, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and that is a cliche which is not inaccurate. We're also going to be talking about that all-important idea of collective action and collaboration. And of course, if that wasn't enough to deal with, we have incentives, ecosystem services, and the very scary prospect of Scope 3 carbon accounting, which is also an enormous opportunity to create that all-important incentive to preserve forests and enhance land and drive restoration, whilst, of course, enriching the communities who live in and amongst them. So we are delighted to have this discussion. It's going to be fascinating. We have here with us Emily Coonan from Nestlé, Bastien Sachet from the Earthworm Foundation, Benjamin Ware from Nestlé, Andy White from the Rights and Resources Initiative, and Fabiola Zerbini, who works for the Tropical Forest Alliance. So welcome to you all. The order of play will be that I shall ask Benjamin to start off with a kind of introduction, high-level introduction on what's been learned and done over the last 10 years or so. And then we're going to turn to Emily, who's going to talk through the forest positive strategy. And this is framed by a new report, which is just published today, which I would commend to you. We shall send you all a link to it or a copy of it afterwards. I was just commending the folks at Nestlé before we started, because it's actually readable. It doesn't have lots of pictures of smiling, diverse stakeholders and lots of corporate doublespeak. It's refreshingly honest and does not shirk away from the challenges. So it's going to be a useful read for you, I think, as a follow-up to this session. So after we hear from Emily on the forest positive strategy, we are then going to have a panel discussion, and we're going to hear from Andy and from Fabiola and Bastien before you can put your questions to the panel and to Benjamin and Emily as well. So please use the Q&A function here. Just a point of note, if you write a very long Castro-style epic essay in the chat, that might be very satisfying for you, but I will probably not have time to read it out, no matter how brilliant it is. So if you could keep your questions or comments concise and to the point, and if it is just a statement, you can't really expect me to read them all out. So best to have a concise question that gets to the point and is on topic, and then I should be able to put some of them to our panel. So there's a bit of guidance for you. And then at the end, I shall ask Benjamin to offer some concluding thoughts before we finish on the top of the hour in about 55 minutes time. So that's how it's going to work. Benjamin, let me turn over to you for an introduction and some reflections on where you've got to so far. Benjamin.
Thank you, Toby. You know, as you were saying, it's important that we recall a bit the legacy and the past before we talk about the future. So I'd like to start, as you were saying, by recalling, you know, to everyone that back in 2010, our journey on forest, on the protection of this very precious ecosystem has started. We were one of the first company basically to commit for deforestation-free supply chain. And, you know, in all honesty, at the beginning of it, even the definition of this wording and vocabulary was a bit gray. For the first few years, it was really a moment of truth in regards to how are we going to make that operationally. We were convinced that it was the right thing to do, of course, from a moral standpoint, from our consumers, but even more important for the long-term, you know, business continuity of the industry and of Nestlé in general. So it's very important to recall this aspect that what is good for the planet is actually good for the business. So for a decade of work, we've basically started like anyone with Excel spreadsheet by, you know, mapping supply chain origins, by defining, you know, this concept of tiers from tier 1 to upstream through the cooperative, through the mills, giving names, you know, to GPS coordinates, to these polygons that define the farms, you know, going on the ground, boots on the ground, assessing, deploying these auditing schemes, partnering with what we thought at that times would be alliances like NGOs and NPOs, but actually figuring out that a lot of those can be very good friends and allies in tackling the challenges that happen at farm level. Because when we talk about deforestation, we talk about basically farmer resilience, survival in many cases. Then along the way, you know, technologies have kicked off and came up to our plate to help us with Earthworm and Airbus bringing their innovation with Starlink, using and leveraging blockchain and satellite services to speed up the verification of this deforestation-free status. And, you know, we came then landing in 2019, 2020 with a trade-off to do, with a trade-off to say, do we really want to hit the 100% target that we made 10 years ago at any cost, and not only financial cost, but social cost in many cases for farmers, smallholders around the world? Or do we take a moment to rethink this strategy, and maybe phase a new journey? And at this moment, basically, we published our 90% performance landing against the deforestation-free commitment on our 5 commodities. Our CEO gave us, you know, 2 more years to achieve this 100%, to give extra care to the smallholders and to the farmers. But it was also the turning moment to basically bring into the soup the climate agenda. And now today, back on the basis of our net zero commitment to the UN Global Compact and the 1.5 degree pledge, we have basically upgraded our forest strategy, not only not to harm, but actually trying to do good. And the intent of this basically webinar is to give you the blockbusters of this doing good strategy, how we want to do that, how we're going to enlarge the way we look at supply chain, go to landscape. And that's the subject of the presentation of Emily.
Thank you, thank you, Benjamin. Emily, so tell us what forest positive strategy looks like.
Sure, let me just make sure. Can you see the slides now? Great. So it's great to be here with you all to give you an overview of the strategy, which, as Toby mentioned, is detailed in this report that has just been launched. I'll just take you through quickly an overview of that strategy. But as Benjamin was mentioning, it is really important to understand the approach that we're taking going forward to understand where we've come from. As Benjamin was mentioning, when we first started on our no deforestation journey in 2010, we didn't really know where ingredients were coming from or what the risks were. And so we had to start really with the basics of supply chain mapping, assessments, and developing and deploying the right tools that could address those risks. And so what you see on the screen here is just a summary of what those tools are that we've been using to date. We call this a toolkit approach because we think it's really important to recognize that there is not a single tool, whether it's a certification scheme, a satellite monitoring system, that on its own will deliver deforestation-free supply chains. We have to use the right tools in combination with one another to be able to get there. And so that's what's shown here. What Benjamin was also mentioning is through this approach, we've arrived at the end of 2020 with 90% assessed deforestation-free supply chains. And so what you see on this screen and what you would see in the report is just that broken out by the 5 key ingredients that are included and broken out by the different tools that were used for the assessments. I think what you see here in the numbers, that captures part of the picture, but it's also important to recognize the achievements that we've made as far as learning about our supply chains, learning about deforestation, what the drivers are, and also what the opportunities are to stop deforestation. And so I think through our work to date, particularly through that satellite monitoring that we've been using at scale since 2018, we've really got granular insights into what the drivers of deforestation are and what companies like Nestlé can and should be doing to address it. In particular, I would say we've learned about how dynamic and complex those drivers are. And so one thing that's been a really key takeaway is that what caused deforestation in the past or where deforestation happened in the past is not an indicator of what will happen in the future. So we really need to have systems that are dynamic, adaptable, and engaged on the ground. So that's what brings us, I guess, to today, to the evolution from our no deforestation strategy to our forest positive strategy. So I guess what you see on the screen here is really that approach summarized in just 3 key pillars. The first pillar here is, and I think people, maybe when you hear forest positive, you think that we're moving away from our past focus on deforestation-free supply chains. But the first pillar here shows that we are still very much committed to deforestation-free supply chains. As Benjamin mentioned, we haven't hit the target in 2020, but we're aiming to get there for the end of 2022. That remains the foundation. But we know that alone is not going to get to the forest positive future that we need to get to. And so we also have these 2 other pillars. The second one is that we're going to be more active and forward-looking about conservation of forest within our supply chains before the trees are lost. So that means that we will first assess where there's still risk of future deforestation and forest degradation, and then we'll invest in conservation and restoration in those areas. And to kick that off, we've announced that we're committed to planting 200 million trees by 2030. Now, the third pillar is about investing in sustainable landscapes where our ingredients come from. Our past ways of working were really focused on sites in our supply chains, so the farms or the mills, and looking at what the impact of those individual sites were on forests. But now we really understand and appreciate the importance of viewing those sites as an integral part of an overall production landscape. And we have to work to ensure that agriculture production, forest protection, and respect for human rights can all coexist in those landscapes. One thing that's really important in our recognition and kind of the shifting mindset that we have is also that we recognize the central role that there is for the inclusion of Indigenous peoples and local community rights in assessing and addressing forest risk. So that's also going to be a central component across all 3 pillars of this strategy. And then all of that is underpinned by advocacy and transparency that's needed to create the right enabling environment for the broader change. So I think we could spend probably a few days going into detail on all of that. I just have 10 minutes here to give you the summary. So I just want to highlight a few things in particular about how our ways of working will be different. So on that second pillar that I mentioned about active conservation and restoration, one of the tools that we're going to be using is a forest footprint. So this is a tool or a methodology that we initially piloted last year in Aceh, Indonesia, around our palm oil supply chains. And what this does is it maps areas of standing forests, peatlands, and customary rights that overlap with sites that could be in our supply chain or that are nearby those sites where expansion could take place in the future. And so you see some of the key numbers on the screen here. So just around our palm supply chains in Aceh, there's almost 90,000 hectares of forest and peatland and customary lands that are actually within palm oil concessions that could be in our supply chains in the future. And then if you look at the area just outside of concessions that could be suitable for future palm oil expansion, there's almost 1.5 million hectares that were identified. So you can see through this that by using the same tools, the supply chain mapping, the satellite monitoring that we've used in the past to detect deforestation after it happened, we can now use them to actually be more forward-looking and identify areas where protective measures are needed, and then invest in the conservation and restoration in those areas. So we did this pilot last year. We're expanding to more areas this year. And we'll take this global and across commodities for the key forest frontier areas by 2023. The next aspect that I wanted to highlight is around pillar 3, the sustainable landscapes pillar. And just to illustrate what we mean by this, here we have an example of the Cavally Forest in the Ivory Coast. And this is a forest that's near an area where Nestlé gets cocoa from. It's a forest that's pretty well preserved, but it is under threat of encroachment from cocoa cultivation, from gold mining, et cetera. And so Nestlé recognized that if nothing was done about this, this forest, it would likely be cleared to grow crops or for mining, and that would lose really important biodiversity and carbon stocks. And so for that reason, Nestlé invested 2.5 million Swiss francs to finance a 3-year project that is implemented by the Côte d'Ivoire Forest Agency, SODEFOR, and Earthworm Foundation, who's here today, that's aimed at really protecting this forest through a landscape approach. And this means combining some critical different activities, including restoring degraded areas, protecting the remaining forests, and increasing the resilience and improving livelihoods for cocoa farmers. So in this landscape, forest conservation, land regeneration, and farmer resilience are completely interlinked challenges. And that's actually the case in many of the landscapes that we source from. So it's really important that we take these holistic approaches at a jurisdictional level to protect forests. By 2023, we'll be investing in at least 15 landscape initiatives like this one. So we know that we need to shift our own approach with how we engage our supply chains, how we engage the sourcing landscapes, where we get ingredients from. But we know that actually to fully achieve the forest positive vision that we've laid out here, we really have to also support the development of the enabling environment that removes deforestation from commodity producing landscapes. So we are also committed to using our stakeholder engagement work, our advocacy to do that, and particularly focusing on the topics that you see here on the screen, which we've identified as priorities. So this is around supply chain transparency, due diligence legislation, smallholder farmer inclusion, producer country engagement, and private sector collaboration with other tiers of our supply chains and across industries. So I'll just end with this slide to say that we know we do not have all the answers at this time. It's similar to what Benjamin mentioned about when we initially made our no deforestation commitment. We know that we need to still develop the tools. We have a lot of learning to happen, but what we do know, sorry, is that we have to evolve the approach that we're taking. We have to have more organizations joining us in this mindset shift to be more forward-looking about protecting forests, keeping them standing, about recognizing how interconnected different activities are within the same landscape, such as agriculture and forest conservation, and recognizing that livelihoods and human rights are absolutely central to a forest positive future. So what you see on this screen, and I won't read it all out to you, is some of the key milestones that we're working towards today for our forest positive strategy as part of our broader climate pledge. So getting to reduce our emissions by 20% by 2025, having them by 2050. You'll also see on here that by the end of this year, we'll finalize our operational plan for this strategy. So there's more details coming. Ultimately, I think the key point is that to reach net zero, we have to ensure how we produce and grow our food conserves and restores forests. And we know that to do that, there is this mindset shift that is needed. So I think this is an exciting moment for us. The voices on the panel here represent some of those really key topics and challenges and approaches that we need to be embracing as we move forward. And we hope that many of you who are here listening to this today will ultimately join us in that journey. So I'll hand it back to you, Toby.
Thank you, Emily. Let me turn first to Andy White from the Rights and Resources Initiative. So Andy, briefly tell us what RRI is, and then I'd love to know what you thought of the report, having had a couple of days to read it. And then thirdly, and most importantly, what has all this got to do with land rights? So Andy, over to you.
Okay, well, thank you, Toby, and thank you, Benjamin and Emily and Barbara and all the colleagues at Nestle for this invitation and this organizing this meeting. Well, what does RRI do? RRI is a coalition of organizations that are dedicated to advancing the recognition of Indigenous peoples, community land rights, and particularly women within those communities, and ensuring everyone has kind of equal rights and roles in governing their lands. So that's who we are. We're a bunch of organizations, and I represent the Secretariat that helps foster work around the world on this front. A couple impressions reading the report. First of all, it's just, well, one, I can't believe it's been 10 years. I mean, for those of us who have been around, it's been amazing that it's already been 10 years. But the first, other than that, was just impressed with the seriousness of the effort by Nestle, and congratulations to all of you who've been toiling away doing this, all these tools, all these meetings. The second was that this forest positive view that Emily just described, it's not just tree positive, and it's not just forest classic biophysical positive. It's a different concept of forest. It's forest which includes people, right? Toby, you're surrounded by trees. You're a person in the forest. You have some effect on that forest. That forest has some effect on you. And right now, just looking at the KPIs that Emily just presented are still technical, biophysical. So I think that's just off the top of my head, that's one thing to think about going forward. We need social KPIs as well as biophysical KPIs to advance this forest positive view. Related to that is that this is a major shift. This is from a do no harm risk management perspective to a do good and kind of more development perspective, and it's just breathtaking and to be congratulated. But and it does mean that it require embracing the social and the land rights, as you said. The other impression I had reading through the report was, where's Nestle's work on land rights in this front? Where's this interlocking group that Nestle co-founded in 2013 and has been actively working behind the scenes with other companies and NGOs co-hosted by RRI to figure out how to operationalize the VGGTs. And it was surprising for me to read this story and not see, in thinking about what happened, what explains that? I thought, okay, maybe it's an over-exuberant interpretation of the Chatham House rule. But then I realized it's silos. There's a silo within Nestle and a silo within our group that was dealing with land rights, and there's another silo that was dealing with forests. And I think in some ways, hopefully the report we're reading is a report of the past, and the report that on the next 10 years will look very different. That has an integrated, positive view of people and rights in forests. So those are a couple of impressions and some recommendations about how to achieve this positive and integrated view of Nestle's role and responsibility. Not only Nestle's, that's what I think is so particularly positive about this, is Nestle is eager to learn and eager to use its political and financial capital. But three things seem to me, and my colleague Bryson Ogden, who is leading the interlocking group on this, we think are particularly important to going forward. One is to really shift more towards this community-based monitoring and engagement. You're starting down that path already, but we love satellites. Great maps are an important tool for some things, but nothing, as Toby, you said in your opening remarks, culture, people, voices, and recognizing that they are legitimate citizens in their own spaces, and talking to them directly, and that will be, I think, very important. That sensitivity and understanding and embracing and supporting them, get their rights recognized. Secondly, is using Nestle's leverage to get governments to do more on the land rights front. I think that's consistent with the Pillar 2, what Emily just presented. But many governments are resistant. Some governments are open to this, doing more on the land rights front. Nestle, in some places we know, has encouraged governments. Much more needs to be done on that front. As you said, Toby, secure land rights is not only the cornerstone of sustainable land use and production, but it's also the cornerstone of governance and government and democracy. If we want sustainable landscapes and achieving these goals, we have to have much more progress on that front, and Nestle and others can do much more. We're pleased that Nestle has gotten this on the attention of the Consumer Goods Forum. So again, Nestle is leading many companies in this space, but much more can be done. And the third point I'll raise is that Nestle, along with others, can do much more in figuring out and developing the innovations to leverage more finance for securing land rights. Like 1/1000th of all the climate, all the ODA, Overseas Development Assistance, and climate change over the last 10 years, 1/1000th has gone into securing land rights. That's just an abominable shame. And we're nowhere close to the billions that are needed to map and register and help communities talk to each other and figure this out. We need to crack this nut, and we need Nestle and colleagues to figure out how to do it. And I'll end by just saying that one of the new initiatives that Nestle is involved in, I think, is indicative of both the potential and the challenge, and that is this LEAF initiative. Well, LEAF is the Coalition Lowering Emissions Through Forest Finance, through forests, and there's associated things with. But right now, LEAF is designed in this art registry to net zero. Is basically it is designed to incentivize governments to take land rights from carbon rights from local people. With a few tweaks, it can be incentivize governments to recognize land rights. And that, so as currently designed, it looks more like the past. With some tweaks, it can look like the future and be forest positive and consistent with the rest of the goals. So I think that I hope that Nestle can bring this forest positive view, an integrated view, people and trees, KPIs that are social and biophysical, to its own work and to the rest of the private sector and governments where it operates. So congratulations again. I hope you and Nestlé are toasting yourselves tonight somewhere along the Lac La Mer or wherever you are in the world, not only for what you've done in the past 10 years, but even more so about what you're starting today. And starting the next 10 years will look very different. I'm looking forward to that. So celebrate tonight with what you've started. Thank you.
Thank you, Andy, and some important challenges there. And I'll ask Benjamin perhaps at the end to offer some final thoughts on the challenges ahead, because as you say, Andy, moving on to the front foot as opposed to being on the back foot means you open up a whole lot of doors that a lot of business people would rather have remained shut in the past, such as engaging in land tenure. You know, the classic boardroom response is, what business is that of ours? And if you look at past initiatives and company engagements, it can end quite badly if you're not careful historically. So the question is, what are the coalitions that will drive this forward? Because rights being the fundamental when it comes to the carbon forests or any aspect of sustainable development. So thank you. We've got lots of questions in the chat, so I'm going to move on quickly. Fabiola, lovely to see you. Thank you for coming. TFA has a very unique position, sitting in the middle of governments and their development agencies and business, and of course the active NGO community, and of course indigenous communities. So what are your brief thoughts on the report, and what would you like to see happening to take forward the ideas in this report further? Fabiola.
Thank you. Thanks, Toby. Thanks, everybody. Thanks a lot for the invitation. Are you hearing me well? Yeah? Okay, let's go. So I think when I was reading the report, I was also in some way reading the history of TFA. No, I started to work at TFA in 2015, was in the middle of the last decade, no, and the decade that we used to call like the zero deforestation or the free deforestation decade. No, and for the TFA theory of change, the demand side was and is still crucial as a key factor to really stop deforestation associated with the commodities production. No, and as soon as we got close to 2020, no, we realized together that the theory of change needed to be revised. No, demand side is key. And what we are witnessing here today is the advancements that only one company like Nestlé could really achieve. And this is remarkable. No, this is very important. Many other companies also have many other advancements, and we need to state now and to remark it. No, but we know that is not enough. No, and the deforestation rate is increasing. I'm based in Brazil, so the numbers here are increasing almost each day. No, and we know that there are many factors that are driving this situation: political or ideological orientation, social inequality, illegality, conflicts, lands conflicts. There's so much, and there's a huge impact on the deforestation, polarization, agribusiness in one side, environmentalists in another side, leakage. So many things came to the arena, no, to the equation, and I think we saw the complexity now of the problem. The complexity of the challenge appeared as never, and suddenly in the beginning of these decades, we do have a social and economical, healthy, a public sanitarian crisis, drove by the COVID. So there's no way to deal with this situation.
Fabiola, I'm sorry, we lost your audio volume has plummeted. Could you perhaps make some kind of adjustment? You were very loud, and now it's gone very quiet. Could you try and adjust that?
Can you try again? I would take off myself, my mic.
Okay, that's better. Yeah, maybe just try and project, speak a bit louder. Thank you.
Okay. Sorry, let's try again. Okay, I'm almost there. So I think now the theory of change must be revised. No, and this is exactly what we saw at Nestlé report. No, there's no way to move forward on a free deforestation agenda without really connect to the social inequality, human rights, and food security perspectives. There's no way to move forward alone. The transition will cost a lot. The social and environmental costs needs to be internalized by the supply chain, and no one company can do that. Not only the producers, or only the consumers, and other actors needs to be also involved on the shared cost model, like the finance sector, the governments, I think there's no way to really go without a cross-sectorial multi-stakeholder perspective. Now, the landscape is the place where all of this will land and really impact. And carbon neutrality became the new common target, the new common goal. So we need to, in some way, look to all of this and try to combine this in an agenda that makes sense. We do have good examples on the ground. I'm from Latin America. I will bring some examples that it's from my region, but for sure that all over the world, we do have this bottom-top initiatives like the Cocoa Amazon region, that came from the local alliances around the cocoa production, trying to position in a new product to the world based on sustainability and social and human rights. Like concrete projects like in Maranhão, soy producers will receive in the next month for the biodiversity, water, and the carbon that they are stocking, that they are providing as environmental services, as a way also to guarantee that they will be committed to not deforest, even if it's legally allowed to do that. Many other examples. For sure that this is a very, very collective journey that we need to go together. Emily said that, and I think all of us are agree with that. Nestlé showed us that the last decade, even with other different kind of challenge, but big as well. You got it. Nestlé got it to arrive where we are, and to arrive to the perspective that Nestlé and others need to keep the vanguard approach, the leadership approach, and count on the multi-stakeholders platform like us to really guarantee that will be done in a way that will impact. So let's be inspired, but let's be again, I think strengthened to go to a new decade and a new kind of challenge, but for sure that there's no way to back. So I think that this is, we are here at this moment exactly celebrating something, but being able to start and the next decade have another celebration like that. Thank you.
Thanks very much. And in the interest of time, because we have now 31 excellent questions, I'm going to move on. By the way, well done, audience. I mean, this is the 31 best set of questions I've seen in the last year and a half anywhere. Keep them coming. We can't get through all of them, but we should definitely archive them, because I'm sure the folks at Nestlé will be taking them away and thinking hard about them. We'll come to them in a minute. Before that, Bastian, over to you. I remember 10 years ago being with you and Scott Poynton and others when I remember Scott saying, wow, the company's actually serious about this. They really are set to change. And I'm so pleased that Scott was right. So talk us through your perceptions of the journey, the report, and in particular, what comes next. Bastian.
Thanks, Toby, and hi, everyone. Very happy to be here with you. Yeah, 10 years of life have gone by and a lot of work behind the scenes. Today, I'm not going to be so objective because we've been very much part of the journey since the beginning, alongside with Emily, Benjamin, and other people within Nestlé. I just would like to start with an anecdote, an example, a concrete example, because we see a lot of targets, we see a lot of KPIs, but there are key stories behind it. In 2014, we engaged a company called Grupo Palmas in Peru, who was one of Nestlé's suppliers, because we were engaging all the suppliers. And they had a big piece of forest in the Peruvian Amazon to be cleared, to be planted with palm. And the local population wanted it cleared. They wanted the jobs, they wanted everything associated to it. And there was a big dilemma and a big discussion that took place between the suppliers and Nestlé to say, what do we do? And Nestlé said, look, if we are going to continue doing business together, you need to keep that forest standing. And eventually, after a lot of discussions and work, the supplier agreed, is now one of the leading sustainability commitments around palm in Peru. And this forest is standing. And it asked the question, what do we do with it going forward? Is it going to be there for the long term? So it was already putting on the table, what does forest positive means, and how do we make sure that this forest stays standing? And there's a lot of questions, as Andy mentioned, that are linked to human rights, development opportunities. At the end of the day, we come back to people. So what I wanted to say is that all this journey has been driven by people and is going to be driven by people at the end. So driven by people first within Nestlé. I think we should not forget that the commitment starts from the top, but then it's the work of the whole company to engage and to basically learn about all this complexity. And I think the learning curve about the 10 years has been about understanding the supply chain, understanding the complexity, and diving into it. And I think many companies don't do that work because it's costly and it takes time. And I want to take the hat off to Nestlé for having done that. It's about being humble as well, because at the end of the day, there is no made solution. So that engagement is about listening to what the supplier has to say, co-designing and working with him. So engage, within Nestlé, the people within Nestlé, the people within suppliers. So this journey is only done with the suppliers. And I remember the work we done very early on with Golden Agri Resources, engaging and co-developing the high carbon stock methodology, which is now widely used, but which helped define what was in practice deforestation and what wasn't deforestation. And I think we had to create the tools as we went, and that needed a lot of innovation, a lot of engagement. And last but not least, but engagement with farmers and communities, which is what we are really into now, which is about figuring out what's the value proposition for them, as it's not always clear if you come with just a forest angle. So what we've learned is that this work of engaging people and mobilizing different communities around the world and along the supply chain in this journey, it's created a different ecosystem, which I think is very, which shifts the landscapes globally, because it has driven decommoditization, which means more stable supply chains. And I think without that, it's very difficult to build a forest positive future. So that step was very important, because eventually it is about recognizing who is on the other end of the supply chain, and that person exists. It's not just a ton of palm oil or a ton of soy. It's a farmer from that place producing things and raw materials in this way. And that stability is what we can build on to preserve forest in the long term and to create this forest positive future. Supply chains have been very extractive over the last years of human and natural capital. And I think this move that Nestlé is making towards forest positive for us is just the opening of a new journey that calls for regenerating that capital. And what I'm very happy to see is that it's not just words, because it's been announced that significant resources are going to be being put on the table to regenerate those ecosystems, because it will need resources. I think Fabiola mentioned it. We'll need a hell of a lot of resources. And the fact that Nestlé is pioneering that, for me, is something very positive. I just want to, so that we've got time for questions, and I know Toby will like that. We've got some key challenges that we will face. The first is learning to collaborate more with others. I think in corporates, there's always naturally ego and competition. And I think the fact that you can lead also, is about you going and following what you want to do, but also bringing the other onto the journey. And I think that is the chain reaction that can be triggered in this way that will drive change. So the second big challenge that I see is that the tempo of nature, the tempo of behaviors and communities is different than the tempo of investors, KPIs, and decision makers in corporates. And there is a huge tension that exists in our world today between the desire to go fast and the time it takes to transform. And I think it's not, that tension is is something that we have to recognize and grapple with, which means that it's a shared approach between top down, but also that gives the time for co-design and the time for engagement. At the end of the day, the solutions will work if the engagement and the co-design with communities, with farmers is done well, so that the solutions that are developed are fully owned. And I do think that coupling this strong drive and ambition with that ability to create a space is going to be a good challenge for the future. So thrilled to see the results, very optimistic and confident about the fact that the same drive, if not more, is going to open the next 10 years. And yeah, looking forward to the journey.
Thanks very much. So many great questions here. Benjamin's been working very hard trying to reply to some of them. Thank you, Benjamin. I'm going to pick a couple of them. I'm going to ask a quick question for Bastien and then ask Emily to offer some clarification on palm, because there are lots of questions about where palm sits in your report. Bastien, a quick question for you. When you hear about this headlong rush towards addressing carbon in scope 3 and supply chain. And then you hear about the idea of ecosystem services payments for farmers, which has been a dream we've all had for a decade or more. How do we create that extra incentive? Do you sometimes get a bit concerned about this headlong rush towards carbon and the question of who owns what? Because there seems to be an awful lot of work that needs to be done very quickly to make that bit work.
First of all, I welcome it because it puts the focus on soils and forests, which has not necessarily been the case in such a fashion in the past. So now the whole investors community of this world is looking at soils and forests, thinking they are precious. We need to regenerate them. We need to protect them. So my first reaction is to welcome it. The second reaction is to say, let's be careful in not looking at a complex system with just one lens. Carbon is one element of the whole thing. It's a hook, it's an opportunity to get more engaged into the problem, to get more involved into the problems. So I think the responsibility that companies have, and this is very much what we are already discussing with Nestlé, is to make sure that this is done in the right way, which is, as I said, in collaboration with farmers, so that the value proposition is not just one for the downstream, where we can count the tons of carbon and say we're doing well. It's something that lasts and is a real value proposition for the upstream. And so, yes, all sorts of incentives will be created, but in co-design, which means taking the time to work and to listen on the ground. And I think that's probably the key and the big challenge for all of us here to figure out how to create that space and show up the good examples.
Yes, you can certainly see attention being focused on carbon justice for communities and smallholders in the coming years, can't you? So, Emily, quick turn to you to talk about the palm oil questions we see. Just perhaps offer a bit of clarification or explanation on those as best you can. Emily.
Okay, and I'm trying to quickly read them. So this is about the performance at the end of 2020, right, Toby?
Yes, there's a few here around palm.
Yeah.
Just kind of asking really kind of where it sits and what the challenges are.
Yeah, absolutely. So at the end of 2020, we were at 70% assessed as deforestation free. I think there's some additional complexity in palm compared with other supply chains. One is that every palm sourcing origin that we have has a risk of deforestation in the general region. And so we do need to look at each and every point in the origin. Another kind of factor is that most palm oil supply chains include smallholders. And so the challenge that Benjamin mentioned about this trade-off between getting quickly to deforestation free and addressing livelihoods means that each and every palm ingredient that we are sourcing, we are having to map plantations and smallholders and do that analysis with our satellite monitoring systems and our supplier engagement about what the deforestation free status is. And so I think that just is reflected in the score that it's taking a bit longer, but we are confident of being able to get there by the end of 2022.
Thank you. Benjamin, did you want to respond to Andy on the Interlaken group point? That seemed worthy of clarification.
Yeah, and first of all, I would just acknowledge those points in saying that today, I mean, we mainly talk about environmental sustainability, but we all know that none of those things happen without people. And actually the solutions for environmental sustainability challenges lays down with the social agenda that we execute and we operationalize. So point taken, and no excuse to be given, nor no argument to open. I think it's very fair to say that we need to break these silos. We actually need also to give greater visibility on what we have done on our human rights agenda and on the FPIC, the land rights. We've deployed a number of tools to give a voice to farm workers. So not only to take care about the farmers, but also the farm workers that are on these lands. So I think it's an excellent suggestion to break these silos and to come, in hopefully not 10 years, but in a few years with a progress report that will give the full lens of people, planet, and profit, because the economical viability of these farmers is also, the elephant in the room. is everybody needs to make a living. Everybody needs to make a margin. We have no right to say these communities needs to continue to barely survive or don't have the documentations or the paper for their land. We've been working with a few of our partners to help on that. So, I mean, to make it short, you've said 2 minutes max. Point taken and very fair to say, and we will do so.
Thank you. Yeah, lots of great questions here. I mean, Jukka from Wageningen has a really great question, which any of you could comment on. Really about how farmers, how can they learn a living income while they're expected to protect the forest? Can they be incentivized enough to become forest stewards and earning a decent income at the same time? And I think that encapsulates the multifaceted challenge we have here. Forest Positive seems to me to be encouraging really a framework to enhance sustainable rural development, and whether that's multiple income streams for farmers, or whether it's the potential for ecosystem services. It's got to be that mixed approach, and whether that might include land consolidation and so on, and tenure. What are the issues there? There's an awful lot to unpack there, but I wondered if any of you wanted to take on Jukka's point about how we get there. Benjamin, let me turn to you first on that one.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that. So first of all, definitely, I mean, the conversation started today on this willingness to reward for environmental services and to nurture and to boost nature in the landscape where we are sourcing from. There is definitely a need both for the farmers to establish really its P&L of a farm. What is the revenue by a crop that is growing, so that he can really professionalize the way he discusses with the client. But on our side, we have also a duty. We need to move away from this monocrop buying model where we buy only palm, we buy only coconut, we buy only coffee. Basically, this forest positive agenda is nurturing the need for companies like us to buy multi-crop and to have a buyer going to the supply chain nodes and to say, I'm keen to buy coconut that grows to coffee from the same farms. And I think if we have this top-down coming from the clients, pulling for agroforestry, for multi-crop production at farm level, and then also a wake-up moment from the farmer communities that they have to do two things. They have to federate themselves. It's a bit unpolitical what I'm saying, but they have to federate themselves, get together, and point to really master the economics of their farms. And that was one of the learning of the last 10 years. A lot of these farmers, the first thing that they ask us when we tell them, what would you like from us? They say, could you please help me to establish my business plan, and not only the paperwork of the farm's documentation and things like this. So that's what we are going to do even more in the 10 years to come.
Thank you. Andy, Bastian, let me bring you in a second. Andy, a quick question for you on that. I'm not saying that you or your organization has this view, but there's a perception that some in the NGO community have this, this idea of the sort of romantic smallholder on their noble plot of land. But in reality, of course, some of those plots of land, well, most of them are unviable, and some of them are getting smaller. So, is there a need in the community that you work in, and I know it's a disparate set of views, to recognise the potential for consolidation in some way, shape, or form, done in a just way that could actually help drive this agenda that we all want to happen, i.e. better tenure, access to finance, ecosystem services? Or is there still a challenge in your network of getting to that point, Andy?
Yeah, good. No, I think the issue is that it starts with land rights. And there was another question about what's the difference between rights laborers and producers in coffee. I think it was in Ghana. No, it was cocoa in Ghana. No, it all starts with land rights. I mean, Toby, I don't know whether you bought that land where you're sitting, that little bit of forest, or whether you're renting, or it's an Airbnb, or but there's lots of fragmentation. Fragmentation is not the issue. Its issue is clarifying land rights and making sure the rights holders have options. And if they don't have options about how to use that space, very difficult for them to know and have options about what to produce, to invest in it, to leverage the capital, to make sure their labor is valued, for them to engage the local government. So a lot of production and economic development democracy starts with secure land rights. Not everything, but let local people figure it out. Let's not top down try to design it and either force people to aggregate or encourage people to disaggregate. As forests around the world demonstrate, there's a lot of 10-year options. What's most essential is making sure that the rights holders have the knowledge and political space for their voices to be heard in the government system.
Yeah, and of course, there's equally important is that education piece about what the opportunities are for them should they decide to take one option or another. And that's absolutely key, isn't it? Of course. Bastian, we're almost out of time. We've got about 5 minutes left. And I have a question for you, Fabiola, about government engagement. But before that, Bastian, you had something you wanted to add.
Yeah, very quickly, I don't think ecosystem services or carbon is a magic stick. I think what will work is to build on the supply chain that have been rebuilt. The reconnection has been created to the farmers or is being recreated. And that reconnection is a channel for doing many, many things, including the land rights, including the investment, including extension services and technical support. All of this will be a mix of things. Farmers don't want to be assisted to be, maintained in a state of underdevelopment so that the forest can be standing. It's not going to work. So it's really about lifting first the farmers, the forest will follow.
Thank you. Fabiola, are you still with us? Your video is off. I just want to make sure you're here before I ask your question. Oh, there you are. You're here twice. So good she's here twice. Fabiola, what have you learned with TFA, with your engagement with governments, about ways in which companies like Nestlé can work effectively in the political frameworks to do this? We all remember the lessons of IPOP, the Indonesian palm oil pledge, and history is littered with the corpses of initiatives that haven't done proper political economy analysis of what they're getting into effectively. And of course, we see resource and agriculture nationalism everywhere in the world, not least in your home country. So what's your advice to Nestlé on how they kind of can navigate the political minefields here to try and achieve some of these objectives more effectively?
Hi, thanks, Toby. Well, not easy at all, not only one minister, for that, because each government and each mandate, has a different approach and needs to be considered. And so any kind of governmental engagement needs to be very flexible and very strategically oriented, to really guarantee that the results will be there. But first, on the positive side, like the public-private partnership, it's real now at this time. And so how to really collaborate on some positive agendas, combining the rural credit that some countries does have huge amount of money to invest and to their own agribusiness sector, how to combine the private sector funds to guarantee that we will then move forward. So I think this is not the easy piece, but it's the one that I think we do have many good examples, and we can evolve a lot. We can do a little much more on that. But the problem is on the structuring actions, like land regularization, common and control. These are normal role. This needs to be done normally by the governments, needs to be paid by the governments. No, this is kind of, we call like the structuring actions. And I think the private sector really needs to understand how to collaborate with the governments, how and when to ask, how and when to collaborate. I think this is a key balance also on these structuring pieces, because without this, without land regularization, without a good common and control in place, unfortunately our actions and good examples as we are seeing today will not be impactful or meaningful enough. So I think this is, but needs to be understood and considered in case by case, and really well supported and as collective as possible. Really formed by the local private sector, but the global private sector does have a huge role, and I do have huge expectations on that also to influence a little bit more my country towards a more forest positive agenda as well.
Let's hope so. Absolutely. So a closing question for you to reflect on, Benjamin. Perhaps you can build this into your closing remarks. We're almost at the top of the hour. So Anita Neville asks, on reflection, would Nestlé have changed anything in terms of where it invested effort in terms of focus on monitoring versus focus on livelihoods / community engagement. This is the kind of back foot, front foot question, isn't it? To avoid deforestation. I thought that would be quite a nice question to end on, as maybe you'd like to build that and answer that into your closing remark.
Exactly. So I think, I mean, first of all, I feel a bit like back in 2010, we're at a moment of a crossroad. We know where we want to go with the forest positive strategy, with our net zero pledge. We know some of the tools that we're going to use, you know, on this road, but we don't know all of them. So, you know, one of the thing that we wanted to tease with this announcement is to search and to get some innovations coming to us as we hunt for them as well in our forest positive strategy. Maybe to the comment you've just made, you know, one of the lessons that we've made over the last 10 years is, let's not try only to police and control, but let's try really to boost and incentivize. This has a much bigger effect long term. So that's definitely the change versus the past. We're embracing a strategy which is much more about engagement, rewarding, incentivizing, than policing, controlling, monitoring every minute. So the last comment is, as usual, you know, there is no way we can do that alone. So we need not only, you know, our peers and our competitors and the industry in general to do that, but we need everyone in the value chain to embrace the same strategy and basically go for this space. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Benjamin. We're going to finish up now. We will be continuing this conversation, as will Nestlé, over many years to come. We have our Landscapes and Commodities Forum, which takes place at the end of November, early December, and we'll be discussing all this in much greater detail there. I mean, what we're talking about here is the focus of pretty much that entire conference for over 3 days. So we would be delighted if you would join us for that. I've posted a link to the report down there in the chat. I've also posted something that we're working on, which is our Action Research Coalition, to look at exactly these questions. We've been working with Nestlé and GIZ, the German Development Initiative, Golden Agri and others on this. And the next iteration of that proposes an action research approach so that we can try and get better answers to these growing lists of questions. So we're really enthused about the change in paradigm from the back foot to the front foot. Looking forward to continuing the conversation. You will all get a link to listen to this again. And you will get a link to the report as well. I urge you to read it. It's commendable, but I think we would all agree we're at the beginning of their journey 10 years on, because now we know much more about what we have to do. And as somebody once said, better to tell someone something they can do than something they can't do. And that applies to my 5-year-old son as much as it does to socioeconomic development theory. And I think that's a good point to close on. So thank you all for joining us. It's been a fantastic discussion. We plan to continue this and we will be in touch. In the meantime, thank you so much to Nestlé and the speakers for joining us for the last hour. Thank you very much and goodbye.